so happy to be here with you all tonight. I am especially excited because one of the things that we'll be talking about tonight is what does it actually mean to be emotionally healthy? What does it mean to be emotionally well, to be aligned? What does it mean to be coming from this place of vertical alignment? I talk about vertical alignment a lot, and I've touched on it throughout some posts and throughout previous conversations, but we've never really dove in. So I'm excited tonight to really dive into the conversation surrounding emotional intelligence. And I have my old trusty friend here with me, Daring Greatly. This is the book that actually I read for the first time that really catalyzed my own journey of becoming emotionally healthy and becoming emotionally intelligent. What even is emotional health, and what does intelligence surrounding emotions even look like? And one of the things around this book, Daring Greatly by Dr. Brene Brown, that really stood out to me throughout this time of diving into it. I was starting therapy at the time 4 years ago, almost to this month. And it really reframed the way that I looked at it surrounding emotions, because I just had always viewed them as weakness. I had always viewed emotions as something to be ashamed of, something to silence, something to hide and suppress. And so during this time of kind of learning about emotions in general, my entire perspective on them completely changed. Y'all, we spend so much time ever since we're kids, 5 years old, we start going to school and we're cultivating the intellectual intelligence. Yet we never is a strong word. For the most part, there's no educational programs. There's a few popping up here and there, but there's few that really incorporate emotional cultivation around how to breathe through emotions, how to kind of work through when we get really upset as kids. There's really no tools to equip the parents nor to equip the children on how to process emotions. And so this is what we'll be talking about this evening. And let's go ahead and dive in. I'm actually going to start with reading a section from Daring Greatly. For those of you who have been following along, I like reading different quotes, or even I read a part of Theodore Roosevelt's speech, Man in the Arena, a couple of times now, actually, just because it holds so much resonance for me and so many aspects for us to learn from. You know, not a lot of people talk the way that he did. And we just don't have a lot of those conversations coming from the White House that we used to have that were truly very inspiring. And I love pulling that speech out. But I'm going to read through a little section of the chapter Debunking the Vulnerability Myths by Dr. Brene Brown. Myth number 3, vulnerability is letting it all hang out. One line of questioning that I often get is about letting it all hang out and this culture that we find ourselves in. Can't there be too much vulnerability? Isn't there such a thing as oversharing? These questions are inevitably followed by examples from celebrity culture. What about when movie star X tweeted about her husband's suicide attempts? Or what about reality TV star who shares the intimate details of their lives and their children's lives with the world? Vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, it's not purging, it's not indiscriminate disclosure, and it's not celebrity-style social media information dumps. Vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. Being vulnerable and open is mutual and an integral part of the trust-building process. We cannot always have guarantees in place before we risk sharing. However, we don't bare our souls the first time we meet someone. We don't lead with, "Hi, my name's Brene, and here's my darkest struggle." That's not vulnerability. That may be desperation or woundedness or even attention seeking, but it's not vulnerability. Why? Because sharing appropriately with boundaries means sharing with people with whom we've developed relationships that can bear the weight of our story. I love that. The result of this mutually respectful vulnerability is increased connection, trust, and engagement. Vulnerability without boundaries leads to disconnection, distrust, and disengagement. In fact, as we explore in chapter 4, letting it all hang out, or boundaryless disclosure is one way we protect ourselves from real vulnerability. And the TMI, too much information issue, is not even a case of too much vulnerability. vulnerability is bankrupt of its own terms when people move away from being vulnerable to using vulnerability to deal with unmet needs, get attention, or engage in the shock and awe behaviors that are so commonplace in today's culture. Y'all, I'm going to read that again. Vulnerability is bankrupt on its own terms when people move from being vulnerable to using vulnerability to deal with unmet needs, get attention, or engage in the shock and awe behaviors that are so commonplace in today's culture. To effectively dispel the myth that vulnerability is a secret sharing free-for-all, let's examine the issue of trust. And I might pick this back up here in just a few minutes, but y'all, there is something so incredibly important about when we talk about vulnerability that's happening a lot. And I've actually been hearing a number of folks talk about vulnerability in a way that is not true to the definition of what vulnerability actually is. And so it's really clear we define terms here when we talk about emotional health. Vulnerability versus authenticity. Now, vulnerability has gotten way more popular and trendy now. Authenticity has gotten a little bit almost like oversharing, like people have been hearing that word too much. So it's lost some of the integrity of the word. Yet when we consider those two side by side, vulnerability and authenticity, they have very different purposes. Authenticity is coming forward in a way that effectively is true to who I am, regardless of the situation, whereas vulnerability is a depth and also a breadth of what I'm going to share with someone who has earned the right and earned the trust and degree to which I will then go into the depths of my soul, even perhaps unprocessed territory. So there's effectively degrees of vulnerability depending on the degree of the relationship. And so to just go and drop our pants in front of everyone, that's dangerous for ourselves, but it's also dangerous for them. Because when we engage in a vulnerable connection with someone, it's effectively assuming that they're buying in to engage with us in a similar regard. We're sharing something that we actually truly have some unresolved emotions around to a large extent when we're engaging from this place of vulnerability. And thus, when she says, I just love this line, vulnerability is bankrupt of its own terms when people move from being vulnerable to using vulnerability to deal with unmet needs, get attention, or engage in the shock and awe behaviors. And so when we're engaging from this place of vulnerability with someone who hasn't effectively bought in and said, yes, I'm in, let's go have a vulnerable conversation, we're putting a lot of weight on them that they've never signed off on. And so then we end up getting disappointed and we end up getting our needs not met. And it's like, well, did that person even, one, know that they were engaging in a place of vulnerability with you? And so two, I'll keep going on that list, but I want to pause there for just a second. I have found in my experience and in working with a lot of other executives and even just working with relationship in general, whether it's romantic or on the professional side, there are times when we can come to the table and share things when we know certain information in the backstory, the context of this is actually really vulnerable for me. This is sensitive for me. And the other person does not know that that's where we're coming from. And so effectively, I started out this whole conversation and this whole topic tonight surrounding we need to define terms. We also need to define the state of how we are before we engage in a conversation with someone, especially when we're feeling vulnerable about it. It's effectively waving a flag and saying, hey, warning, that this is something that we need to be mindful of. The person that I'm seeing right now, my boyfriend, I don't know why I felt kind of silly saying that. But the man that I'm seeing right now, we actually use flags in our relationship. And it's effectively saying like, hey, this is a white flag. This is the yellow flag. Like I'm getting more sensitive here. And it's just a quick little, hey, this is where I'm at. And it's just a quick little check. And then obviously the other person has the opportunity to slow down and say, hey, wait a second. I actually didn't know that we were kind of engaging at this level. Let me actually kind of get ready. Or maybe even they're not at a place to do so. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they've got, maybe they're in a busy coffee shop and they can't actually meet me where I need to be met. And so first it's, hey, by the way, this is how I'm engaging with you right now. Is this a good time? And in setting that expectation, one of the things that Brene shared in the chapter that I was just reading, it doesn't mean that we're going to be met in the way that we actually need in that moment when we effectively come and ask for the being met in a state of vulnerability. It doesn't promise that we're going to get our needs met by any means, but what it does do is that it effectively sets, I love Theodore Roosevelt, being in the arena. So let's actually put this vulnerability as like a container, an arena of being vulnerable. We're going to come in and engage in this space. It's different than the spaces that we currently and most often engage in. Vulnerability needs to be honored, and it needs to be cherished, and it needs to be facilitated, and it needs to have boundaries, because it is so incredibly important that we honor what's about to be divulged. And so, y'all, if we're the ones leading with that vulnerability, we have to set the stage, we have to set the container, we have to set the expectation for that person that they're about to engage with us. And it is so critical that we do that. Otherwise, it is unfair, and we're setting ourselves, both us and them, up for failure. Because if they don't know, there is no way that they're going to be able to meet our needs and kind of square off with us in that place. So when we think about vulnerability versus authenticity is really the MO. That's how it's supposed to be in terms of how we show up every day. When we're working with different brands and different entrepreneurs, executives, it's like, okay, well, who are you? Let's go ahead and figure that out so that we can show up online in a very authentic way. And then you're consistent at every single touch point, whether it's the website or the emails that are sent, also with the stories that are shared. And sometimes there might be some kind of like drips along the way of vulnerability. But y'all, when we think about the vulnerability versus authenticity, vulnerability often is what's unprocessed. It's typically what has yet to be kind of worked through and healed. So when I think of vulnerability, it's like, man, there's actually like an open wound. There's something where maybe there is a Band-Aid, but there's healing going on. When I first started, the very first mastermind I was ever a part of, I was actually part of it it was like right after my former husband moved out. And so I was wide open, all the wounds exposed. And so we would each take time to share on a biweekly basis where we were at, professional, personal, or otherwise, whatever we were struggling with over the span of the previous 2 weeks, we could bring and discuss. We had 10 minutes to share and then 10 minutes to receive feedback. It was effectively hot seats every other week. Incredibly, incredibly helpful. I love that format. And so in that setting, that was a container where everyone knew that they were coming forward, where they could share vulnerably, or they could share and say, hey, I'd actually really like advice here. Kind of that second step in terms of engaging in vulnerability is, so in this whole topic of like, effectively, these are the open wounds, right? So then it's telling the other person, this is how I would like you to engage with me. So here's the container. Here's the arena where we're going to square off and have this conversation about vulnerability. Second, this is what I need. So we may not always know what our needs are. God only knows I don't. Some of the times that I'm engaging in that container of vulnerability, I'm kind of processing what I need while I move through it, which frankly is relatively dangerous for the other person. And so we need to pick that person wisely, because if they come in with all the advice and that's not what I need right now, that could shut me down even further than once I started. And so when we identify the person that we welcome into the arena, we set the expectation, hey, we're entering the arena. Would you join with me? And then second, this is what I need right now. And it can also look like, I don't know what I need right now. Would you be willing to listen? And we can kind of figure it out together. Paul, you just said on Instagram, the state of the union conversation. I love that. Once a week, so important for couples. Paul, I absolutely love that whole concept of actually scheduling these conversations as couples, because y'all, we need to be entering into the arena on a regular basis. Otherwise, so much time can elapse and so many new wounds can open, whether it's wounds from the past, whether it's wounds about something on the business level. I had something happen for me earlier this week on a professional level that was so sad and so disappointing. And so it's like, okay, I got to process this. Let me not confuse my disappointment with this thing professionally and misattributing it to something on a personal level, whether that's blaming the kids, whether that's blaming your partner, whether that's blaming your parents for something because they're the closest ones and they're taking you out to dinner. If we don't take the time to process and go into the arena, we're going to have misappropriated and misattributed pain, whether it's pain far from the past that's showing up in the present, or even something recent from the professional side that's infiltrating our personal lives because we haven't done the work to get into the arena. So number one, setting the stage. Hey, I'm heading into the arena. Would you join me? 2, I don't know really what I need. Will you listen and ask me questions? Y'all, asking questions is probably one of the most important things we can do. So when we think of the role and responsibility of the person who is effectively being the vulnerable party, and then the other party who's listening and engaging, what's their job? What's their responsibility in this? So one, it's what's my answer going to be when they invite me into the arena? Do I have the time, the mental and emotional space? One of the things with my partner that we really have to move through is am I even in a place where I can actually engage in this conversation in a way that's going to be life-giving for him? Or am I at my max? Am I in a physical space that I can realistically engage right now, or am I going to be interrupted? And so these practical kind of checklist items when we're about to engage and go into the arena of vulnerability, both parties need to take radical responsibility before going in with the other person, whether it's their own vulnerability at stake or they're engaging to help their partner. If we don't take into account, as the party that's going in with the other who is vulnerable, if I don't take into account the physical setting that I'm in, my own emotional state, and also kind of my own mental blocks, one of the things that can be probably one of the worst, not just having the other person come in and give advice, but if they go get distracted, man, that can shut somebody down faster than anything. If all of a sudden I'm on the phone with someone and I'm like, hey, are you there? Or they catch me and I'm scrolling while we're talking on the phone, man, that's so not good. So really taking into our mental capacity, emotional capacity, physical capacity. And effectively, y'all, this is the conversation of engaging our intelligences, our spiritual intelligence as well, our mental, our emotional, and our intellectual intelligence. All of us need to be present and activated in these conversations, lest there be, honestly, additional reason to experience pain. You know what I mean? Like the wound is already there. We're already in the arena for something else. And now this is an additional reason, another thing to fight over. And I gotta say, man, I've experienced this so many times in almost any single relationship, whether it's platonic, romantic, professional. If I'm already activated, I'm going to be activated that much more quickly and so much more easily. Whereas if I'm coming from a place of relative baseline, calm, ease, effervescence, even, it's going to be much harder for me to be activated. So it is kind of like, hey, warning, wave that flag. I'm activated right now. And so the more we know ourselves, we can welcome the person into the arena, say what we need. And then third, as I'm thinking about this whole conversation of vulnerability, I actually was in the shower earlier tonight and I was just thinking about this. When I talk about vertical alignment, I have an acronym for it, ALIGN, ALIGN. And A is awakening the physical body. That's really the time when we turn on the physical intelligence. L is where we listen to our soul. What's going on the emotional level? And then I is illuminate the truth. Y'all, we have to, this is third. So inviting someone into the arena, telling them what we need, and then third, reminding ourselves of what is true and even telling the other party what we know is true. By the way, so what this looks like is I am feeling super activated and super upset about dinner Tuesday night. I did not like the way, and this is all fictional, but I did not like the way that this went down. I'm super upset. And then second, what I actually need right now, I don't even know how we're going to get to the point of reconciliation, but I just need to process with you and tell you what I'm upset about. Third, what I know is true is that I love you and I know that you love me. Speaking the truth and reminding ourselves of what is true is so incredibly important. I cannot emphasize this enough. That is why illuminate the truth comes after listening to our emotions, because we actually have to know what's going on inside. We cannot ignore the truth. I was actually at brunch this morning with a girlfriend and we were talking about how growing up, Christianity and the spiritual aspects of life, of God, of the Bible, were so disparate from emotion. And it was almost like, okay, well, God says don't be angry. Okay, well, I feel really angry right now. What do I do? Paul, you just said two people can absolutely have these two very real truths. And actually, a dear friend of mine, we were on the Knowing podcast, and he said, the mark of maturity is the ability to hold in tandem duality, to hold two conflicting truths. Because my experience of dinner at Tuesday night could be very different from your experience at Tuesday night. Tuesday night's dinner, but y'all, we have to move through our own experiences. So going back to, and when I say experiences, the way that I kind of visualize this whole concept. So we'll actually use that dinner table Tuesday night as an example. I'm sitting on one side of the table. I'm having my experience. He's sitting on the other side of the table. He's having his experience. And then God only knows what really happens in the middle, like the actual reality of what actually took place, the facts. And so I have to understand what happened for me. And then he's got to do the same thing. And then we have to, then also empathy is what puts us in the seat of the other. So authenticity is knowing my experience. Empathy is sitting in their experience and understanding it from their perspective. And then the vulnerability is the communication thereof. It's the ability to express with empathy and authenticity working hand in hand. And it's effectively like, I almost think of like the arena of vulnerability is almost guarded and shouldered by empathy and authenticity, so that and the reason why I harp on the authentic part and why we have to know our own experience is because for so many years I ignored mine. I literally had zero idea about what my own intuition was saying. I had shut down and disassociated myself from that part of me for two and a half decades. And so when it came to trying to understand my experience, I had no idea what it was. I had no idea how to access it. And that part of me, my own intuition, was like fundamentally broken. I was disassociated from my own self. And so in working to repair my own intuition and the ability to be taught from within, both in terms of what's my own experience, but then also like these other intelligences, what actually in the past could contribute to here in this moment to help me have a boundary? What in the past could help contribute to acting with wisdom in regards to this professional situation? All of our intelligences need to be turned on, activated, working, alert. All of their representatives effectively need to be able to come into the boardroom and share. And then I then can hear each one and then make an informed decision. But for so long, my emotional intelligence was completely turned off because I didn't have any access into my soul. And so therefore, I was fundamentally disassociated from a part of me. And so when we sit in our experience, it's, as Paul on Instagram said, it's effectively understanding that part of our experience that's a form of the truth. My therapist said this years ago. If I'm shutting off my experience, I'm shutting off a third of the truth. Oh, my earring just fell out. I'm cutting off a third of the truth. And y'all, that's terrifying. You know, we're shutting off a third of reality. We're shutting off a third of the picture of what is. And so just sitting in the other person's experience, doing that alone is detrimental and dangerous in order for us to not enter into a codependent relationship. And codependency, you know, I was doing some digging into this during my time as I went to Croatia in May, and I was learning more so about how literally codependency, especially if you start kind of adopting those behaviors in childhood, just being so attached and needing the affirmation and validation of someone else, it literally wires our brain a certain way. So when we think about kind of moving away from codependency, there's a new wiring and new patterning that needs to take place. It takes work, it takes intentionality, it takes practice. And for so long as we're living disassociated from ourselves, we will never be able to break free from codependency. And often that codependency shows up in relationship with people that can either be really codependent themselves or are very emotionally unsafe. Paul on Instagram just said, it's about disconnection, and reconnection is what builds trust. It's an important part of relationships. Oh, I love that. It's about effectively repairing the connection pieces. So when we think about, so we've talked about the two parties in the arena. So the person who is vulnerable, the person who is effectively being welcomed into the conversation around vulnerability. So for the party that is vulnerable, their job is to first set the stage. Hey, I'm entering in the arena. Will you come with me? Second, these are what my needs are. Third, I know what's true. And then the other party, effectively the person who is being welcomed into the arena, they need to make an informed decision to enter based on their physical, emotional, and kind of mental states. Am I in a place where I can enter into this and operate in alignment with my own ideal? Second, have they actually taken stock of their own experience? So when the vulnerable party comes into the arena and they're like, man, this is what I need. I'm pretty upset. This is what's going on. The other party, man, there's a lot that could come flying at them. So yes, if they need to take stock at the beginning of, okay, am I actually in a place where I can have this discussion? But am I also aware of what my experience has been? Because y'all, what I've been learning over the last couple of months is that as I have been learning to sit in my experience, that still needs to come first as much and as often as possible. Because what I can end up doing is really sit in empathy with the other person. But then I'm like, wait a second, that's not my experience. And then I start almost getting angry. It's like that little Christine in me that never had a voice when she was 7 years old. All of a sudden she starts like tugging on my arm and she's like, wait a second, you haven't heard my side yet. And so while I'm taking the position of empathy for the other party, all of a sudden it's like that little kid in me comes out and is like, wait a second, this isn't fair. You haven't heard my side yet. But if I can first sit in my experience, ideally, and really understand what happened, how that little kid in me is being activated, how it's upset, how it feels unfair, et cetera, I can actually do some tending and do some parenting. Y'all, when we think about our role as human beings, so much of it is effectively like, man, loving on those little kids, those little parts of us that never actually continued to grow up. I read this book called Homecoming by John Bradshaw, and it's this beautiful, beautiful book. And effectively, the concept is that at each stage of our lives in growing up, we stopped processing and growing up when we didn't move through the emotional tunnel and move through the emotion to then continue to grow. So there's like, because of this little experience when I was 5 years old, I still have a little part of me that's 5-year-old Christine that needs to actually just get a little bit of TLC and then she's ready to grow. And then there's another part of little Christine that's 7, and there's some parts of me that needed healing there. There was 12-year-old Christine that this boy I liked kind of snubbed me when I was 12. And ever since then, I held this real desire to always appear older. And when I started healing in my journey of coming to know myself, y'all, it impacted what I wore. Literally, that experience as a 12-year-old impacted the clothing choices at 28 years old. So the past holds on to us, and those little kids in us, whether they're adolescents or little kids, they are like voices on our shoulder weighing in on the decisions that we make today. And that is a terrifying thing when we think about 12-year-old Christine acting out and making a choice to inform 28-year-old Christine. And then we sit and we wonder. I was talking, at brunch this morning with a dear friend of mine. We were reflecting on how sometimes we're like, what just happened? Like, who did I just become? That's not how I normally act. And we like catch ourselves by surprise because that anger comes out, or that 12-year-old snubbed little girl comes out, and we're like, what in the literal dickens just happened? And so with going into the arena on a regular basis, to Paul's point of just doing this on the regular, going into the arena with a therapist, going into the arena as a couple, if we do this on a regular basis, we come to just know those parts of us that need the tenderness. We go in and we can heal it in that moment. And whether it needs healing over a couple of weeks or months, or whether it can be healed all at once, the goal is that we're not being caught by surprise, and our subconscious is not the one in the driver's seat, that the 12-year-old isn't the one in the driver's seat. The 7-year-old whose dad left isn't in the driver's seat. But really, our true self, the adult, you and me, is the one at the helm of the ship, making the big decisions for our lives, rather than this little kid who's so upset. We effectively become the parents that we needed, who have now the tools to be able to heal, to self-regulate. And so going back to Brene Brown's book, I think we're in chapter 2 of Daring Greatly, around dispelling and debunking the myths of vulnerability. Y'all, it's so important for us to recognize that in this whole process of going into the arena, of learning some of these tools that are so incredibly helpful, it's not about showing up naked everywhere. It's about taking the time, and I really, really mean this. I really believe it is most important that we take the time first alone or with a therapist to do some of that processing work. That is radical responsibility. It is radical responsibility for us to show up, do the work for ourselves, to then be a better partner, to then be a better mom and dad and business leader and entrepreneur. Y'all, I've seen so many partnerships, both professional and personal, fall apart. Families broken because we don't take the time to know who we are, to know what we're called to know effectively our nature versus our nurture. Who was I told to be versus who actually am I? But the more we take radical responsibility to know, the more we're going to be able to show up in alignment with who we were created to be in the first place. And then the overflow of that is life-giving love to everyone around us. The vertical then spills over into the horizontal to change the atmosphere and environment in which we find ourselves. But we can only do that by doing the work and by going inward and taking radical responsibility.